This is a cause very close to my heart, but greetings from Strasbourg, and I'd like to welcome, even from Strasbourg, everybody to Dublin, and I hope you're having a most enjoyable time. So, what I have to say this morning, reflecting my experience as European Ombudsman for the past 2 years, focuses on the need for plain language when the institutions of the European Union are communicating with EU citizens, and some of this, of course, has relevance for all administrations. And by way of background, as European Ombudsman, I deal with complaints against the EU administration, the European Commission, for example, made by EU citizens and residents, as well as by corporate entities with registered offices within the EU. I work, of course, in a multilingual environment. The European Union has 28 member states and 24 official languages, including Irish. In recent years, English has emerged as the default common language, or lingua franca. English has displaced French, which, as you all know, for several decades was the dominant linguistic and administrative influence on what is now the European Union. Multilingualism is a culturally enriching feature. Any of you who are fans of Irish literature in English will know that two of our greatest Irish writers, James Joyce and Samuel Beckett, thrived as writers only when they moved abroad. To France in the case of Beckett, and to Italy, Croatia, France and Switzerland in the case of Joyce. Their engagement with other languages, and particularly so with Joyce, was a significant boost to their artistic creativity. Oddly, in this morning's context, both of these writers were capable of writing very simply and clearly, but also on occasion in very convoluted and unclear language. The opening lines of Joyce's Finnegan's Wake are enough to send shockwaves through the heads of all plain language advocates. He wrote, "River run past Eve and Adams, from swerve of shore to bend of bay, brings us by a commodious vicus of recirculation back to Howth Castle and environs." I mention this because I find that in the more mundane world of public administration and dealing with citizens, the same institution is capable of both very clear writing and on other occasions precisely the opposite. Inevitably, multilingualism creates communication difficulties that do not arise in an individual state which is monolingual, or at least has one very dominant language. In the EU, for example, its legislation has equal validity in each of the 24 official languages, and as a result, not surprisingly, it can sometimes be difficult to reconcile linguistic differences between the various language versions. But since coming here 2 years ago now, I have also realised that what is considered plain language in one culture is not necessarily considered so in another. In some countries, there is a greater tolerance for lengthy communications and the use of verbose language than is the case in English-speaking countries. I have heard it suggested that in some non-English speaking countries, there is an expectation that communication from political leaders and from the administration will be lengthy and verbose. In 2007, the then Venezuelan president, Hugo Chavez, did a marathon 8-hour television broadcast to his people. And I think I can say with confidence that this feat would not be welcome anywhere in the English-speaking world. In the case of English, as everybody knows, the plain language test requires short sentences, simple structure, and reliance on a vocabulary and references that the intended audience or readership can be expected to understand. This means using language which is inclusionary rather than exclusionary. It involves working within the context of shared meaning between the writer or speaker and the reader or listener. The objective with plain language is to help the reader or listener to understand the message, of course. Plain language is a great help for the many people with reading difficulties, but it is much more than a simplified language for these people. In this plain language universe, there is no place for jargon, for insider language, for displays of verbal precociousness or fluency in another language. In particular, those with legal training have to avoid the temptation to use Latinisms, sine die, mutatis mutandis, ratio decidendi, and so on, have to be consigned to the dustbin of history, except where the communication is aimed solely at one's own legal colleagues. Plain language can be even more effective in the written form, where it is supported by intelligent design and formatting. Selecting the appropriate font and font size and the choices made as regards spacing can contribute significantly to making a document attractive, more readable, and indeed more likely to be read. The length or duration of a communication is also an issue, and increasingly so, because increasingly people are less able to cope with lengthy documents or presentations, and I will say more on this later on. Ideally, at least in the English-speaking world, a communication must not only use clear language, but it must also be fairly brief. And this brings me, of course, to the issue of the medium, or media, in which a communication is issued. Increasingly, people, including myself, do their reading on electronic media, such as tablets, smartphones, and personal computers. This has implications for the message being conveyed because, as Marshall McLuhan famously preached in the 1960s, the medium is the message. This, as I understand it, proposes that there is a symbiotic relationship between the content of a message and the medium through which that message is communicated. The truth of this proposition is best illustrated by the use of Twitter. Being confined to just 140 characters for public tweets, the medium exerts a huge influence on what is actually said and how it is said. A tweet can be no more than a signpost to a larger message, or perhaps the conveying of one single fact or idea. Tweeting requires compressed language and the use of abbreviations. In fact, the language of tweeting has evolved into a distinctive language of its own. I was going to say the language of tweeting is sui generis, but I shall refrain. So where public bodies use Twitter to communicate with citizens, as is happening increasingly, the need to use plain language is the same as in the use of any other medium. The key test is that the words and characters used must make sense to the average citizen and not just to so-called Twitter geeks. As European Ombudsman and as Irish Ombudsman, I promote the use of plain language by the administration for a very simple reason. It is a requirement of good administration. The right of EU citizens to good administration is a legal right. The EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, which has the force of law within the EU, recognises the right to good administration. This right, under Article 41 of the Charter, provides that an EU citizen is entitled to have his or her affairs handled impartially, fairly, and within a reasonable time by the institutions, bodies, offices, and agencies of the Union. So implicit in this right to good administration is the right to receive clear and effective communication from the EU's institution, whether in relation to one's own affairs or in relation to the role of the institutions more generally. So I think it's fairly obvious that poor communication on the part of an institution can have negative consequences, both for the institution itself as well as for citizens who it is meant to serve. The negative consequences of poor communication by public institutions are much easier to see at national level, where public authorities are dealing with very immediate and pressing issues: health services, housing, social security, taxation, and so on. At EU level, of course, the issues are not often as immediate on an individual, personal level, but are nevertheless important. For example, if the European Commission fails to explain properly why it has decided to disallow certain expenses claimed by a contractor or project operator, this can give rise to prolonged exchanges and the wasting of much time and energy on both sides. Or if the EU's anti-fraud office, known as OLAF, fails to explain clearly what action it has taken in response to a whistleblower or other report of possible fraud, the person making the report may believe that no action was actually taken. This in turn will give rise to frustration on the part of the reporter, the whistleblower, to lengthy follow-up contacts with OLAF, and to the likelihood of a complaint to the European Ombudsman. This kind of scenario would never come about if the initial communication from OLAF to the reporter had explained clearly that action was being taken. All governments, of course, and their public bodies face challenges in seeking to use plain language in engaging with citizens. The EU, given its governance arrangements and its 24 treaty languages, faces more challenges than most. Perhaps a vast country like India, with its plethora of languages, or Africa, may face a somewhat similar challenge. But I am concerned here specifically with the question of the use of plain English by the EU and by its administration. So one of the peculiarities of the EU in this context is the way in which English has emerged as the default common language. This means that English is being used by EU politicians, administrators and civil society groups here, where, in the majority of cases, it is not actually the speaker or writer's first language. So the term Euro-English, or even Eurish, is often used about this variant of mainstream English. Some mainstream English speakers use these terms with a certain amount of disdain. For my part, I have the greatest respect for EU civil servants and others speaking and writing Euro-English. Their overall linguistic abilities generally put to shame many of us who have English as our first language. Nevertheless, this variant of English can have some negative effects and is not always conducive to clear communication. I think those who use Euro-English are genuinely surprised to find that native English speakers often struggle to understand some of what passes for their first language. So there are two sides to this problem. The first is the inevitability that any self-contained world, and the so-called Brussels bubble is very much a self-contained world, will develop its own jargon and its own insider language. Just at the moment, my favourite jargon term is horizontal rules, and I'm still not entirely sure what it means. The second side is that the English used within the EU government and administration is influenced heavily by other languages, and particularly by French. In Euro-English, legislation never provides, but it foresees. Documents are not held on a file, but on a dossier. And work is not assigned to staff, but is attributed. Procedures are not subjected to checks, but to controls. Decisions are never made, but they are adopted. A senior person never says or states something, but he emphasizes or stresses. Or, if those words have already been used, you'll find him underlining. Another feature of Euro-English is a heavy reliance on the passive voice. It must be borne in mind and it must be emphasized. William Robinson has explained the emergence of Euro-English as follows. The English used in EU texts is often specific to the EU and based on institutions, principles and concepts that have developed, originally in French, over 50 years. The English terminology used, as originally chosen by the early translators for use in the treaties and legislation, has become hallowed by usage and harder than ever to depart from as the years go by. So these features of Euro-English may seem harmless, and it may seem that it is over the top to draw attention to them, but in fact there is a serious side to this, and Euro-English can have some negative consequences. The obvious difficulty is that a native English speaker, and presumably other English speakers who are not part of the Brussels bubble, will find much of this language difficult to understand. The more insidious problem arises from the fact that Euro-English has the capacity to alienate readers or listeners who do not find that it is inclusionary. In fact, the combination of jargon, odd use of terminology, and unusual word sequence undermines the sense of a shared meaning, which is an essential characteristic of plain language. In May of last year, I spoke at a conference in London on a somewhat similar theme, and my contribution was picked up by Michael Skapenker, a writer with the Financial Times. He referred to a 2009 survey which found that while 90% of European Commission staff regarded English as their main drafting language, only 13% of these officials were native speakers of English. He accepted that while Eurish, as he terms it, helps non-native speakers talk to each other, Brussels Eurish affects the way the EU talks to native speakers. And the consequence of this, he said, is to make the EU even more alien for native English speakers. One of the subheadings to his piece reads, "Brussels dialect is a gift to the EU's foes." He observed, as the EU has 24 official languages, its announcements in English are aimed not at Italian executives living in Copenhagen or German lawyers in Brussels, but at ordinary UK and Irish citizens. And the further Brussels English drifts from theirs, the more alien the EU seems. He may well be correct in his analysis. However, I think that it also requires some qualification. The alienation effect of Euro-English is likely to be more pronounced in Britain than is the case in Ireland. This is simply because Irish people generally hold a positive view of the EU, while in Britain, as the present Brexit debate shows, there is a lot of negative sentiment towards the EU. But in fairness to the EU institutions and to the European Commission in particular, it is aware of these language issues and has been attempting to grapple with them for some years. Realistically, the challenge facing the EU in this area is major. Compared to public administrations in its individual member states, the EU administration is relatively small in terms of staff, members and resources. At the same time, and recently perhaps more than ever, the EU is attempting to cope with a myriad crises, both internally and externally. Real progress will require an ongoing language awareness campaign for EU staff, together with the support of dedicated communications professionals. In addition, within each administrative unit of the EU, a senior manager should have specific responsibility for ensuring the use of plain language in all communications. But of course, the EU is not alone in having a hit and miss approach to the challenge of meeting the plain language test. I was struck recently by the very different quality of two communications from United Nations agencies. On the one hand, I was impressed with the very clear and powerful statement issued on the 4th of September last by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees dealing with the refugee crisis in Europe. The statement said, in part, "Europe is facing its biggest refugee influx in decades. More than 300,000 people have risked their lives to cross the Mediterranean Sea so far this year. Over 2,600 did not survive the dangerous crossing, including 3-year-old Elan, whose photo has just stirred the hearts of the world's public. After arriving on Europe's shores and border, they continue their journey, facing chaos and suffering indignity, exploitation and danger at borders and along the way. Overall, Europe has failed to find an effective common response, and people have suffered as a result." On the same day, the 4th of September, the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities issued its concluding observations on the initial report of the EU on its implementation of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. These observations included the following. The committee recommends that the European Union mainstream women and girls with disabilities perspective in its forthcoming gender equality strategy, policies and programmes, as well as a gender perspective in its disabilities strategies. And there is much more in that same vein. I do not doubt but that this second statement can be understood by those to whom it was primarily addressed, EU officials, European Parliament members, my own office, as well as NGOs active in the disability area. But I suspect that an ordinary reader would not have the insider knowledge or indeed the patience to get to grips with the committee's statement. Clearly, the statement by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees was a high priority one and may have benefited from the involvement of a communications professional. The conclusions of the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was a more routine communication and may not have had the benefit of such a person. The fact remains, however, and this applies to the EU and perhaps to all international organisations, that routine communications are the norm, and where communications are routinely drafted in language that is not plain, then a cumulative alienation can be the consequence. However, I think it is good to bear in mind that plain language by itself does not always head off all problems. This is particularly true in the course of legal instruments such as national constitutions and international conventions. Many of these are written in direct and apparently clear language. For example, Article 2 of the Treaty on the European Union reads, "The Union is founded on the values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to minorities. These values are common to the member states in a society in which pluralism, non-discrimination, tolerance, justice, solidarity, and equality between women and men prevail." Or, to take another example, Article 22 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU reads, "The Union shall respect cultural, religious and linguistic diversity." Or the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 4, "No one shall be subjected to torture or to inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment." In my view, each of these examples certainly satisfies the plain language test. The communication is direct and without structural complication. The words are mostly straightforward, even if somewhat abstract, but there is no jargon or exclusionary language. So while we might think we understand what is meant in each case, in fact, the application of any one of those provisions to a concrete situation is likely to lead to a number of alternative outcomes and to possible core challenges. Take the case of Article 22 of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. If the EU is to respect linguistic diversity, how far does this respect go? Does it require each EU institution to produce all of its publications and communications in each of the 24 treaty languages? Or is it enough that a citizen can communicate with any EU institution in any of the treaty languages and be entitled to a reply in that language? This is hardly the case, since this right is specifically provided for already at Article 20 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. But you'll be relieved to know that I do not intend to try to resolve that thorny issue here this morning. My point, however, is that plain language will not always necessarily clarify or resolve complex issues. Before finishing, I would like to mention briefly the question of information overload and the impact of social media and electronic communication generally. In Europe, and probably at a global level also, more and more people are getting their information electronically. Social media, which may have been intended originally for interpersonal and social communications, are being used extensively for commercial and public administration purposes. The manufacturers of mustard or bathroom paper, to take just two examples, now invite us to follow them on Facebook. And indeed, my own office, of course, invites people to follow us on Facebook. News and communications generally operate on a non-stop basis. More and more people are skim reading rather than absorbing complete articles or texts. Most of you listening to me now, if you've not already done so, will whip out your smartphones or other devices immediately that I finish my contribution. So our reliance on communications technology is approaching the level of addiction, according to some. So the questions this raises includes, does more communication mean better communication? Does overexposure to communication reduce our capacity to absorb information? Does the widespread use of graphics rather than text imply a significant shift away from language? And has a generation emerged already for whom the traditional form of written communication is almost irrelevant? All of those questions, which I will not attempt to answer, are directly relevant to the plain language movement. So I thank you for your attention, and I wish you well for the rest of the conference and indeed for your stay in Dublin, which I hope will be very enjoyable, and the weather is kind to you all. Thank you very much.
Hello, it's Ben Piper from Australia. I've been coming to the conferences for quite a while, particularly when they're held in Europe. We often have a speaker from the European Union, and it's been quite clear that the European Union has been interested in plain language, has been pursuing plain language for quite a long time, and have put out guides on how to write plain language. I'm just wondering if you could give me an assessment in terms of the documents in English that you've seen from the European Union as to whether you think that they're plain, or are the majority sort of reasonably well written now, or is there still a lot of work to be done in that regard?
Yes, thank you for that. I suppose it's hard to generalise, and it wouldn't be fair to those institutions that do it particularly well. But I find myself now in my conversations in Brussels or in Strasbourg falling into that Euro-English trap. And I suppose, as I said in my presentation, so much comes from the French administrative language. And I found initially, certainly some of the communications that landed on my desk very difficult to understand. But I think the problem lies really in the exclusionary language that the EU continues to use. And let me give you an example. I don't know, and I won't put it to the test, how many people in this room have ever heard of a thing called a trilogue. A trilogue is actually a very important piece of the legislative process within the European Union. It's where, if there is a contested piece of legislation or regulation that has been proposed by the Commission, let's say, that the Council, the European Commission and the Parliament get together in a huddle at the end to strike a deal in relation to that. And that is called a trilogue. And when I arrived in Brussels 2.5 years ago to begin to campaign for the position of European Ombudsman, I would meet many MEPs, members of the European Parliament, and some of them would say, oh, I was at a trilogue this morning until 4 o'clock, or I'm just going to another trilogue, or my trilogue has collapsed or something. And I would pretend, because I was supposed to be knowledgeable about these things, to know what it was they were talking about. But in fact, this is a word that doesn't appear in any European treaty or anything. It's just something that has evolved. But if people like myself and other people outside of the bubble, whom I have asked and who would generally be quite knowledgeable about these things, don't know what is a key piece of the European legislative process, then that says a lot about the capacity, willingness, whatever, ability of the European Union to really explain things. And I mean, because a lot of the work that is done at the European Union level, particularly in relation to regulation and so on, is highly technical, and the administrators are talking about it amongst themselves, they develop their own exclusionary language. And the result is that people become alienated because they feel stupid very often. And they feel, and that feeling of stupidity leads to a sense of anger, hostility, whatever, and they switch off. And the result is that people say Europe is boring, or Europe doesn't say anything to me, Europe doesn't communicate itself to me. And I've made the point again in my talk there that is seized upon as by people who are sceptical about Europe or hostile to Europe as an example of the way that the European institutions alienate their people. So therefore, even though it is very difficult because as I said, there's so many people, so many languages and so many people that need to be communicated to, if the EU political leaders and administrative leaders do not want this drift to continue or this increasing hostility and alienation, they first have to get to grips with how they communicate. And therefore there has to be, and I agree with you, a lot of the DGs, the departments within the Commission do work very hard on this, but it has to be driven from the top. There has to be leadership in relation to this, or else if that failure to communicate, particularly at a time of such crisis, such multiple crises within the EU and at our borders, then that drift will be allowed to continue, and it's a political issue. It's not just a communications issue.
Great. I think that's a reasonably comprehensive answer, and possibly one that even applies, I think, in nation states, not just in the context of the European Commission. Have we any other question? We have time for one more. So we have a lady over here. We could just get the mic to her very quickly. Thank you. Just say your name and then your question.
My name is Sheila O'Kelly. I found what you said was fascinating, and in particular the piece of legislation you quoted, which was written in clear language but uses a lot of abstract words. To me, that's a problem a lot of the time with communication, is people think it seems impressive when they're using a lot of abstract things, and in order to avoid doing that, they need to define what they're saying. So how difficult would it be to go back and get people to take responsibility for each of these abstract phrases and explain what they mean in terms of legislation?
No, you're absolutely right. And again, some of the language, the words that I used are taken directly from French administration, and the words seem like English but actually have a slightly different meaning. So it's difficult. I think that it would be. It is a very difficult task, and I think increasingly it's a difficult task because more and more stuff is being put out there. But something that struck me, and of course when you come to a multicultural environment, you have to be careful not to assume that yours is the perfect one or yours is the one that makes sense, and it very often isn't the case. And one of the early lessons I learned, because it was something I've been trying to do within my own institution, because we deal directly with citizens and therefore good, clear communication is very important to us. And I've been encouraging my colleagues to write in a very simple way, a clear way. I tend to use, I say to them, somebody was explaining a case to me one day, and they were explaining it in quite elaborate and legalistic terms, and it was actually quite an interesting story. So I said, listen, hold on there. Pretend you're going into the pub tonight. Pretend you're in a bar and you're telling somebody what the story is. And I said, you tell me now what the story is. He said, well, there was a German doctor, and what happened was he went to France and this happened. I said, exactly, tell the story. But sometimes people are afraid to use that. Sometimes officials hide behind this language. It's almost like their armour. It makes them feel safe and they're afraid to move out of it. But it was also explained to me that in some countries, sometimes some of the Mediterranean countries, Greece, for example, or some of the other countries, the use of what we would call flowery language is seen as respectful. And short communications are seen as disrespectful. And which is something that really didn't occur to me, because I'm bringing my cultural baggage to bear on it. And what makes mine more valid than somebody from Greece or Italy or wherever. So this is something that I have had to learn. And I suppose that's why in this particular talk I've tried to explore what communication means. So plain language, we understand it in an English-Irish, shall we say, or wider context, but communication is the piece. And particularly when, you know, my kids would not sit still enough to listen to me anyway, but certainly to listen or to read something at this length. And I mean, I mentioned that people are using tablets and PCs and so on. They're using their smartphone, like, for everything. And that is a huge communications challenge, because in 5-10 years' time, you know, and even now, the end of the year, Christmas, when they all get their latest editions of the iPhone or whatever it is, that is going to become increasingly the way in which we all communicate. So there's a huge piece of work to be done on the communications piece. But I think within the EU context, we have to recognise that cultural diversity in relation to not being insulting to people who believe that a certain kind of communication is the more appropriate or respectful one.